Construction projects shape our world, but they can also be places where lives are brutally lost in an instant. From a forgotten tool that led one worker between rows of stored rebar to a measurement check that left a technician crushed beneath several tons of structural steel. Hi, it's Nathan, and you're watching Fatal Files. It was October 23, 2018. A commercial construction project was underway in Henderson, Nevada, where crews were building several new retail structures. Evening was approaching as the workday came to an end. Reed Mullen, 37, had spent the day doing what he'd done for years, moving materials, helping with deliveries, and keeping different parts of the site organized. He wasn't a supervisor or a specialist. Every crew depended on him because he could jump into almost any task that needed attention. That day had been unusually busy. Several deliveries arrived throughout the afternoon, forcing workers to rearrange storage areas to make room. Forklifts moved materials back and forth across the site, and by the end of the shift, the storage yard near the rear of the project looked much different than it had that morning. As the workday ended, crews began packing up and equipment shut down one piece at a time. Trucks started leaving the parking area. If you've ever been on a construction site after quitting time, you know how quickly the place can go from loud and chaotic to almost silent. Reed headed toward his vehicle with everyone else before remembering he had left a tool pouch near one of the storage rows earlier that afternoon. Rather than leave it overnight, he decided to go back and retrieve it. By then, most workers had already left. The storage yard sat behind the main work area, where bundles of reinforcing steel and other materials had been stacked throughout the day. When Reed arrived, he noticed the layout had changed after several deliveries. His tool pouch was farther inside the storage area than he expected, so he walked down a narrow access lane between two storage rows. Only a few workers remained finishing up before heading home. Near the end of the access lane, Reed spotted the tool pouch he had come back for. As he made his way toward it, a subtle movement occurred within one of the nearby storage stacks. At first, it was so slight that it would have been easy to miss. One of the timber supports beneath a large rebar bundle had gradually settled into the uneven ground throughout the day. As it sank lower, the bundle began shifting slightly. Several steel bars moved just enough to transfer more weight onto the bars beside them. A faint scraping sound echoed from the storage yard, followed by a brief metallic grind. The other workers heard it, but assumed it was just part of the usual activity on site. And that's one of the difficult realities of busy workplaces. With so much routine activity happening around them, the early signs of an emergency can easily blend into the background. Inside the storage lane, the movement continued. The bundle shifted again, and several bars rolled slightly out of alignment before the stack suddenly gave way. A loud metallic impact echoed across the yard, drawing the attention of several workers. They turned toward the sound, but with stacks of materials blocking their view and equipment still operating elsewhere on the site, it didn't immediately seem unusual. As the project continued shutting down for the evening, no one realized an emergency had occurred until 20 minutes later, someone noticed Reed's vehicle was still parked in the lot. That's when one worker mentioned seeing Reed walk back toward the storage yard earlier, and a few employees headed over to check on him. By then, daylight was fading fast. When workers reached the storage area, they found Reed trapped within the access lane and showing no signs of movement. A cell phone call for emergency assistance was made immediately. Responders arrived within minutes, but the area first had to be stabilized before they could safely reach Reed. The storage yard was temporarily secured while emergency personnel and investigators documented the collapsed bundle and surrounding material stacks. Investigators later determined that a rebar bundle collapsed after a support beneath it shifted on uneven ground, falling into the access lane where Reed was walking. His death was ruled accidental. Investigators determined that he died from injuries sustained when the rebar fell. They cited uneven ground, inadequate support beneath the bundle, and the way materials had been stored in the yard as contributing factors. The affected storage area remained closed until materials could be restacked and site safety procedures reviewed. A workplace doesn't become safe simply because the workday is ending. Miles away, crews preparing equipment for the next morning were unknowingly creating the conditions for a rapidly spreading flash fire. It was July 19, 2017. A highway expansion project was underway outside Amarillo, Texas. Temperatures remained in the mid-90s degrees Fahrenheit as crews finished widening a busy stretch of roadway. Equipment operators at the project often spent the final part of their shift moving between machines and helping prepare equipment for the next morning. One of them was Shane Keegan, a 42-year-old operator who had already completed most of his responsibilities for the day. Having spent years working around heavy equipment, he was familiar with the routines that kept a project running smoothly and rarely needed supervision to get his work done. The day's production work was winding down, but several routine tasks still remained. Machinery needed to be parked, fluid levels checked, and fuel tanks topped off before crews returned the next morning. Shane had already finished work and was waiting for transportation home. While he waited, a coworker asked him a quick question about one of the machines he had been operating earlier that day. Shane walked back toward the staging area to take a look. Several pieces of equipment had been parked together near the edge of the project, and workers were moving between them, topping off fuel tanks and completing routine maintenance. Shane remained nearby, spending a few minutes talking with co-workers and looking over equipment as the work continued. For most of the crew, it was one of the least remarkable parts of the workday. The process was familiar, predictable, and repeated almost every evening. It's interesting how a job site can feel busiest and most relaxed at exactly the same time. At some point during the refueling process, a small amount of gasoline spilled onto the ground near a portable generator being topped off. As additional machines were serviced, the smell of gasoline became more noticeable throughout the staging area. With each machine that was serviced, the fuel odor became harder to ignore. Even so, most workers treated it as a normal part of the process. After spending all day around heavy equipment, fuel, asphalt, and engine exhaust, the smell simply seemed like another part of the environment. It's human nature to stop noticing things that never seem to change, and in a workplace that can create its own set of risks. By early evening, several recently operated machines remained warm from hours of use. Fuel vapors slowly accumulated near ground level between parked equipment while workers continued finishing their responsibilities. Nothing about the scene appeared urgent. Then, a flash suddenly appeared near the staging area. Flames raced across the ground almost instantly, spreading through the area where fuel vapors had accumulated. Workers nearest the ignition point moved away as the fire rapidly expanded between the parked machines. Shane was still standing near the row of equipment when the flash fire swept through the staging area. With the flames moving faster than anyone could react, he was caught within the path of the burning vapor cloud before he could reach a safe distance. Rather than a large explosion, the event unfolded as a fast-moving flash fire. Several workers heard a sharp, rushing sound as flames moved through the vapor cloud. Heat spread rapidly between parked machines, and visibility was briefly affected by smoke and fire. The entire incident lasted only seconds. Emergency calls were placed almost immediately, while nearby workers focused on helping those caught within the affected area. Activity across the project stopped as attention shifted entirely toward the emergency. Responders arrived within minutes, but the area first had to be secured before treatment efforts could continue safely. Investigators later determined that gasoline vapors accumulated near a portable generator during routine refueling operations before igniting somewhere within the staging area. Although the exact ignition source was never identified, the fire spread rapidly through the vapor-filled space between parked machines. Shane's death was ruled accidental. He died from thermal injuries sustained during the flash fire. Investigators cited gasoline spillage, vapor accumulation, and refueling activities as contributing factors. The affected work area remained closed for a week while the incident was investigated. The hardest hazards to recognize are often the ones hidden inside ordinary work. In Montana, a supervisor was checking on a tensioned cable system, storing enough force to turn a steel line into a high-speed whip. It was September 14, 2016. A bridge construction project was underway near Billings, Montana, where crews were assembling support systems for a new river crossing. Work had been progressing steadily throughout the afternoon. Not every concern on a construction site arrives as an emergency. Most turn out to be nothing, but every now and then, one of them deserves a closer look. That afternoon, several workers reported hearing occasional metallic snapping noises from one section of the project. The sounds were brief and infrequent, sometimes separated by 30 minutes. minutes or more. Most people continued working, assuming the noises were connected to normal construction activity. Eventually, the reports reached Randall Boone. Randall was a 48-year-old construction supervisor responsible for coordinating several operations across the site. He had developed a reputation for checking things himself whenever something seemed unusual. Rather than dismiss concerns, he preferred to see the situation firsthand. The reports all pointed toward the same area. A tensioned cable system had been installed as part of an ongoing structural operation. Several steel lines stretched between large anchor assemblies and were being used to stabilize components during construction. The system had been functioning without any major issues. Late that afternoon, one worker mentioned hearing another metallic snap. A few minutes later, a second worker reported hearing something similar from roughly the same location. At that point, Randall decided to take a look himself. A worker directed him toward the section where most of the sounds had been reported. As he approached, crews continued working nearby, and nothing immediately appeared unusual. Cables remained in place. The anchor assemblies appeared intact, and no visible damage stood out from a distance. Then, another metallic ping echoed across the work zone. Randall stopped and looked toward the cable system, expecting to see some sign of what had caused it, but nothing appeared to have moved. From where he stood, everything still looked completely normal. There's something very unsettling about hazards you can't actually see. A tensioned cable can appear completely motionless, while enormous forces remain stored inside it. Randall continued forward. As he reached the edge of the tensioning area, he paused and focused on the section of cable where the noises had reportedly been coming from. Another metallic snap echoed through the system. A split second later, the cable failed. The line had been weakening throughout the afternoon as individual wire strands gradually broke under tension. When the remaining strands could no longer support the load, the cable suddenly gave way. Thousands of pounds of stored force were released instantly. The steel line recoiled across the work zone at tremendous speed, whipping through the area before anyone had time to react. As it tore across the site, it struck equipment, loose materials, and everything in its way. Randall had stopped near the section of cable that had been producing the unusual noises. When the line failed, the recoiling cable swept across the area and struck him in the upper body with tremendous force, threw him several feet across the work zone and onto the ground. Emergency assistance was requested immediately through radios and cell phones as workers secured the area around the failed cable. Construction activity across the project was halted while the scene was documented and the damaged line was made safe. In the days that followed, sections of the failed cable were recovered and examined alongside maintenance records, photographs, and inspection documentation. Investigators found that multiple internal wire strands had fractured before the final break occurred. Those earlier failures were consistent with the metallic noises workers had reported. Throughout the afternoon, Randall died from traumatic injuries sustained when the recoiling cable struck him following the catastrophic failure. Evidence recovered from the scene helped investigators reconstruct the sequence of events and determine how the failure developed. Findings concluded that the incident was accidental. Sometimes the warning signs are real. The challenge is recognizing what they're trying to tell you. If you're enjoying today's episode, don't forget to subscribe. At a downtown high-rise project in Denver, a concrete worker was about to notice a problem that seemed minor at first. It was May 11, 2017. A high-rise construction project was underway in Denver, Colorado, where crews were building a new office tower. By midday, workers were preparing for one of the largest concrete pours on the project. Brill Tatum was a 34-year-old concrete worker assigned to the pour crew. Unlike many of the workers handling equipment from ground level, much of his shift was spent several stories above the site on an elevated platform attached to the formwork system. Large concrete pours depend heavily on temporary structures. Before concrete hardens, it behaves like a dense liquid, pushing outward against the forms designed to contain it. The larger the pour, the greater the pressure placed on those temporary systems. That morning, crews spent hours preparing the area. Form panels were assembled, supports were checked, and workers moved into position before the first concrete arrived. Once placement began, the operation settled into a steady rhythm as load after load was directed into the forms. Brill's job required him to monitor conditions from above. From the platform, he could watch how the concrete settled, observe the formwork, and relay information to workers handling different parts of the pour. From that position, small changes were often easier to notice than they were from the ground. The formwork supporting the pour would eventually be removed and discarded, but for now, thousands of pounds of concrete depended entirely on it. Shortly after noon, a small amount of concrete began seeping from a connection point near one section of the formwork. At first, it looked minor. A thin stream of wet concrete slowly worked its way through the seam and down the side of the structure. Workers noticed it, but the flow remained limited. Braille kept an eye on it while continuing his responsibilities. Over the next several minutes, however, the leak became more noticeable. The stream widened. Then, more concrete appeared around the connection. From his position above, Brill could see workers below beginning to focus their attention on the same area. Rather than remaining where he was, he walked along the platform to get a closer look at the section where the leak was developing. People often think construction is about building things, but a lot of the job is simply paying attention. So the closer he got, the more obvious the problem became. Concrete was no longer simply seeping through the connection. It was actively forcing its way out. Then, the formwork shifted. The movement was small, but it was enough. A support connection failed. The weakened section gave way almost immediately afterward. Concrete began forcing its way through the opening almost immediately. As pressure escaped through the failed section, nearby panels separated and parts of the formwork collapsed outward. Brill was standing only a short distance away when it happened. As the formwork failed, part of the platform beneath him dropped unexpectedly. He lost his footing as the structure shifted and was thrown from the elevated work area. Several stories below, debris, broken panels, support components, and wet concrete crashed into the work zone almost simultaneously. Workers immediately called for emergency assistance, while others focused on clearing the area beneath the damaged structure and checking on nearby personnel. Brill was located within the collapse area as responders and workers carefully worked through fallen formwork, debris, and concrete around the scene. Recovered formwork components, inspection records, photographs, and construction documentation were later examined to determine how the collapse developed. Investigators found that a critical connection within the formwork system failed under load, allowing concrete to escape and triggering the collapse of the surrounding structure. Brill died from traumatic injuries sustained during the collapse and fall. The incident was ruled accidental, and investigators concluded that the failed connection initiated the sequence that brought down the formwork. Local coverage of the collapse focused on the investigation and the temporary suspension of work in the affected area while the site was assessed. The difference between a manageable problem and a disaster can be surprisingly small. At a commercial construction project in the Pacific Northwest, a routine measurement check was about to take an unexpected turn. It was August 8, 2018. A commercial construction project was underway near Tacoma, Washington, where crews were assembling the framework of a large warehouse facility. Part of Jesse Ray Norcross's job involved documenting installation progress and checking alignment measurements as construction moved forward. The 29-year-old field technician spent much of his day moving between work areas, recording information, taking measurements, and relaying updates to supervisors and crews. Unlike many workers assigned to a single location, Jesse was constantly on the move. That morning, steel components were being lifted into position by a crane operating near the center of the project. As each section was installed, measurements had to be verified before work could continue. Jesse had already completed several inspections before being asked to check alignment measurements on a recently installed section of framework. The location was only a short walk away. Carrying a clipboard, measuring equipment, and a handheld device used for documentation, he headed toward the area while crane operations continued nearby. Large construction projects often involve multiple tasks happening at the same time. While one crew installs materials, another may be measuring, inspecting, documenting, or preparing the next stage of work. Sometimes I think that's what makes large construction projects so fascinating. Hundreds of people can be contributing to the same project while seeing completely different parts of it. As Jesse approached the framework, workers above were preparing another steel component for lifting. The piece weighed several tons and had been attached to lifting rigging connected to the crane. Once raised, it would be moved a relatively short distance before installation. Nothing about the lift appeared unusual. Jesse reached the section he had been assigned to inspect and began taking measurements. The work required him to remain near the base of the framework while crane operations continued nearby. It was common practice on the project for inspection and lifting operations to run concurrently, provided ground workers stayed within marked safe zones. The boundaries had been established during the planning phase, but no one had flagged a conflict between Jesse's assigned location and the active lift overhead. From ground level, it can be difficult to appreciate just how much movement occurs during a lift. Even when a suspended load appears stable, weight is constantly shifting through cables, rigging, and connection points. While Jesse continued taking measurements, the lift progressed overhead without any obvious signs of trouble. No alarm sounded, and from the ground, everything appeared normal. The steel component was nearly in position when part of the rigging suddenly failed. One side of the suspended load lost support, causing the section to lurch sideways before dropping from the assembly. Workers immediately shouted warnings. Jesse looked up toward the movement above him, but by then, the load was already falling. The steel component struck the area where he was working and hit him with tremendous force. He was knocked to the ground immediately, suffering extensive injuries to his chest, shoulders, and upper body, along with severe internal trauma from the impact. Nearby workers rushed toward the scene as debris scattered across the work area. Several workers immediately called for emergency assistance, while others moved into the area to help. Crane operations stopped at once, and personnel were directed away from the scene as crews accounted for everyone working nearby. Jesse remained near the base of the framework while responders worked to reach him. Construction activity across the project was suspended as the area was secured and documented. Investigators later focused heavily on the failed rigging assembly. The damaged component was recovered and examined alongside lift plans, inspection records, maintenance documentation, and photographs taken at the scene. Their findings showed that a rigging component had been damaged before the lift began. Under load, the weakened part failed and caused the suspended steel section to fall. The incident was ultimately ruled an accident. Jesse died from traumatic injuries sustained when the steel component fell from the crane assembly. Evidence recovered from the site helped investigators reconstruct the lift and determine how the rigging failure occurred.